Hi, everyone. Welcome to another segment in Chapter 11, Imperfect Competition. And this segment, we're going to look at specifically the industry structure called monopolistic competition. Now, be careful. Don't ever call it monopolistic and don't ever call it competition. It's monopolistic competition. It's a combination of the two. So we're going to define and explain some of the workings of this industry structure. So here are some of the key characteristics of monopolistic competition. Firstly, there's many small firms all acting independently. So there's not any kind of collusion or huge cooperation between them, but there's many small firms, not numerous as in perfect competition, but just many, and they're all acting independently. Most industries out there fit into this category, like retailing, clothing, gasoline, travel companies, carpet layers, painters, roofers, plumbers, electricians, all those trades that have these, they've got 3 or 4 vans and they're a good size small company. Even software design or some manufacturings like and textile industry, footwear companies and furniture companies, things like that. But if you think of all the trades, you see that's probably the best example, or things like pizza shops and stuff like that are monopolistically competitive. So many small firms out there acting, and there's freedom of entry. So no barriers to entry like monopoly, right? Freedom of entry, just like monopolistic, or just like perfect competition. So there's a bridge between those two, monopoly and perfect competition. And the products are differentiated, not like perfect competition where they're all the same. Here they're differentiated somewhat. And so they all have slightly different products. And that's very, very important distinction. There's also very little price competition, though, even though they have some control over price. Then the reason they have that is because their products are slightly differentiated and there's not like numerous companies selling the same thing. So they have some control over price, but they actually don't practice a lot of price competition. They compete more through the differentiation side of things. They got slightly different products and they advertise those differences. So, but the products are similar to some extent. So let's take a look at what each individual firm in this industry, what they face as a demand curve. So let's take a look at elasticity in general. And in general, the elasticity of demand definitely depends on the degree of product differentiation. The closer that the products are to each other, the greater the similarity, the more elastic the demand curve, because the more the substitutes. And certainly if there's a lot of rival firms producing somewhat similar products, that'll also be a greater elasticity of demand. But when we boil it down and focus on monopolistic competition, let's be a bit more specific. There are many rival firms in here, so that's suggesting higher elasticity of demand. And there is differentiation of products, but not a lot of differentiation of products. So that tells us that there's actually a lot of choice for consumers because the products are somewhat similar, and therefore there's an elastic demand curve. Now, it's important to understand a big difference the way this market is analyzed. We often look at confined market areas. So the example I love to use is we can consider the physical state premises on campus, and there's just a certain amount of lunch kiosks, places you can go for lunch, places you can go to get food at various times through the day. Now, they all compete with each other, but they're all very similar. They're all serving food. So yeah, pizza versus noodles versus sandwiches versus soup, there's differentiation there, but we're going to argue that, hey, it's all lunch and there's, they're all sort of similar. They're substitutes, maybe not perfect substitutes for each other. So that's our framework, but the idea is there's a confined market area. We don't see a whole bunch of new students at any point in time or a whole bunch of less students, and we don't see a whole bunch of new instructors or a whole bunch of less instructors. We don't see a whole bunch of new administration staff or a far less amount of administration staff. On every given day, there's about the same number of people that are out there interested in buying lunch. So let's keep that in mind. It's a confined market area, and we'll look at what the monopolistically competitive firm looks like graphically. So you may be pleasantly surprised, but certainly surprised that if I were to tell you this is monopolistic competition and you're a little bit confused, that's all right, because this looks exactly like a monopoly. Look, there's our demand curve. That's the demand curve that the monopolistically competitive tiny little firm sees. That's the people they see coming to buy their product. There's a demand curve that they face, just like the monopoly, but this one's way flatter. This one's more elastic. That's the big difference, because there's other substitutes in this market. And like the monopoly, there's a downward sloping marginal revenue curve too for the monopolistically competitive firm. So it looks just like monopoly, but keep in mind the first difference I'm pointing out is that this demand curve is very flat. It's very elastic. This one that this particular firm faces in the monopolistically competitive industry, say it's Dave's Pizza Kiosk at Sate, very elastic because there's lots of substitutes to my pizza. You can go anywhere you want at Sate and eat lunch. But then the key rule is what? Find where marginal cost equals marginal revenue and determine the optimal quantity that I want to produce. That's right there. That's the optimal quantity I want to produce. What price can I charge? Well, I look at my kind of elastic demand curve, and on average, I kind of see that's the price I'll charge for my pizza. And I'm smiling because I look up and I've got, in this case, there's my average cost. I come across here. So I'm making economic profits. Remember, profit is price minus average cost times quantity. So I'm making profits in this industry. What comes next is different than what you might think. And this is the second key difference in monopolistic competition. Those profits, because there's freedom of entry and exit, not like monopoly where there's barriers, but like perfect competition, where there is freedom of entry and exit, because there's freedom of entry, other firms will see that me and other representative companies are making economic profits, and they're going to want to get into this industry. So they come and they try and set up a food shop at Sate, but there's only a certain amount of market. There's only a certain amount of customers. So in order for them to set up, once they do, they start stealing my customers in a sense. My customers see more choice, and some of them go over to try the new kiosk. That affects the demand curve I see. So this demand curve I see will shift to the left as some of my customers potentially go look at this new kiosk that's setting up. So let's take a look at that. You can see here where the demand curve shifts left, and that's because those economic profits were an incentive for other firms to enter, and there's no barriers, so they go in and set up another pizza shop perhaps. But because the market is confined, like I keep repeating, there's a certain number of customers and that's it, they steal some of my demand. So the demand curve keeps shifting left, and as long as some of the firms are still making economic profits in the long run, other companies will come in and set up to steal those profits. Eventually, we get to the point where the demand curve is shifted left just to this point, to point A, and it's just touching the average cost curve right there. And at that point, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the quantity I want to produce. The price I can charge off the demand curve is right there. And that's the same thing as the average cost. So at that point, I'm breaking even, or I'm just making normal profits. I'm making a built-in rate of return, but that's where the long run solution of the industry. And so this is where the long run equilibrium position of each firm ends up being at normal economic profits. And there's more companies that will be in the industry then. It is actually expanded because there was initial profits. So let's take a look at the other opposite side of the situation. If you assume that a firm in monopolistic competition is making economic losses, what series of events will occur to return this firm to its long-run equilibrium? Well, it's the exact opposite. If I'm running my little pizza kiosk at SAIT and I'm making economic losses, well, in the long run, I can't sustain that. Maybe in the short run, but in the long run, I can't sustain that. So eventually I'm going to leave SAIT. Other people are going to leave SAIT, other companies, I mean. So when they leave, then the demand that each remaining firm faces actually increases a little bit, because the customers that were loyal to me, or the amount of customers that I captured every lunch, I'm not there anymore, so they got to go somewhere else. So what happens is those other firms that were initially making losses too, they see their demand growing slowly as some of us bail out, some of us producers, some of us sellers of lunch just leave because we're not making money. And that keeps going till those existing firms, the demand curve just hits their average cost curve. And so they start making normal profits again. They're breaking even. So this is the story here. Some firms within the industry go out of business because they're making losses. The demand curve for each remaining firm shifts to the right. So they're gaining more customers. And this just continues until the demand curve is just tangent to the existing firm's average cost curve, and they've got normal profits again. In this case, the number of firms in the industry has shrank because some of them had to leave the industry. So that's the mechanics of monopolistic competition. Notice it's different in its story than perfect competition, as firms enter and exit. And from monopoly, which is its own unique situation, here we have a confined number of customers in a confined market space. And as firms enter and exit, other firms face either decreasing or increasing demand for their product. And that's what takes them in and out of an economic profit situation back to a long run equilibrium of zero economic profits or just normal profits, the exact same solution that we get in perfect competition. So that's the end of this segment. In the next segment, we're going to go on and talk about excess capacity in the long run, how to block entry, a little bit about franchises, and then an overall appraisal of monopolistic competition compared to perfect competition. And we'll see you when we get there.